So last week we looked at the career of Socrates of Athens, the father of ethical philosophy. A weird little dude who never wrote anything or established a school or had official students. But the young men of Athens liked to follow him around and imitate his methods. One of those young men would go on to become one of the most famous philosophers in history. Somebody who would write some official philosophical schools of thought, who would establish a school. And he was somebody who was also in attendance at the trial of Socrates. He's mentioned as having been there. And we know him as Plato. So Plato was sort of a student of Socrates, even though he didn't have official students. Plato, incidentally, would later go on to found a school in which his most famous student would be Aristotle. So the three most famous names of Greek philosophy, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all had this teacher-student relationship to each other. And by the way, does anybody know who Aristotle's most famous student was? He went on to conquer most of the known world. Alexander the Great. For a couple of years was a pupil of Aristotle's. He was his tutor. In any case, we're today concerned with Plato. And Plato's great contribution to philosophy, something that has been called the most important school of thought in all of Western philosophy. It's been said that the whole history of Western thought is a series of footnotes on Plato. And that is the philosophy of idealism. Now, when you use the word idealistic today, or talk about idealism, we sometimes mean it in almost a kind of a sneering way. We would dismiss somebody as just being an idealist, as somebody that's not grounded in practical reality. But the official meaning is this. Idealism is the belief that the objects of thought are the true reality. We're going to spend all week exploring what this means. And I'll warn you at the outset that Platonism is not just a definition that you learn and then you understand it. Platonism is a way of looking at the world that you just have to get used to. You become acclimated to Platonic thought. We have all week to do this. So here is my crash course in Plato. You could spend all semester just on Plato. You can spend a whole scholarly career on Plato. We have a week, so I'm going to start with that. What's that on the board? And you're sure it's a square? It's not a triangle? It's not an octagon? It's not a giraffe? It's not my shoe? Of all the things in the world, this could be square. That's how you identify it? Okay. How do you know it's a square? What is the definition of square?
4 equal sides, 4 equal angles.
Okay, so a square has 4 equal sides. And it has 4, what are these angles? 4 90-degree angles. What else are the qualities of square? Any curious properties of the opposite sides of the square? Okay, it has parallel opposite sides. How many dimensions does a square occupy? It's a 2-dimensional figure. Okay, so very good. You have defined square. Euclid would be perfectly pleased with your definition. Anything that has 4 equal sides, 4 90-degree angles, parallel opposite sides, and is a 2-dimensional figure must be a square and nothing else than a square, yes? You're acting suspicious just because you know I'm setting you up. But that's a square, right? Euclid would define a square in this way. Now, while you've defined square very well, that's not a square. That is an ink mark that I made on the board with this pen. You saw me do it. Let's take a look at these definitions. Do we actually have 4 absolutely equal sides here? No. You can tell that this one is about 3 millimeters longer than this side, so the sides aren't actually equal. Are all the angles 90 degrees? No. You can tell that this one is 90.0014 degrees. This one is 89.96 degrees. They're all a little bit off. What happens if we extend these sides out to infinity? They're eventually going to cross, right, on one side or the other. So, there's no parallel lines in nature. You learn that in school, too. Do we at least have a two-dimensional figure?
If you don't consider the ink's thickness.
Oh, that's a good point. No, it extends about 1 micrometer into the third dimension, the height of the ink mark on the board. Okay. So the ink mark I made, which you all pretty confidently identified as square and even defined it, has actually failed every single definition of square. Now, it's not surprising that this student or that student might have mistakenly identified it as something that it is not. Students make mistakes. But all of you looked at this and saw squareness in this ink mark, even though there's no square on the board. So how is it possible for all of you to make the exact same mistake? How do all of you look at this ink mark and see squareness? Because if it's not on the board, then where is the square you all saw? In your mind. Well, it's true. You did learn it in grade school somewhere. But that doesn't really answer the question. That just puts off the question. It's an idea in your mind now, but you had to learn it from your teacher, who learned it from their teacher, who learned it from her teacher, all the way back to Pythagoras or Imhotep or somebody. Somebody had to be the first human being to come up with the concept of square. And that person never saw an actual square in their life. All they've seen are crude marks. So if the perfect square does not begin in the mind, and if it does not exist anywhere in nature, then where is the perfect square that we have come to understand and define? Where's the only place it can be? So where is the square you recognize? It's got to be in some higher realm than the mundane, crude, imperfect world we see with our 5 senses. It's got to be above this world, or like behind this world. And only our thinking can access the idea. We never experience it with our senses. And all of you have the ability to perceive this idea expressed to varying degrees in the world around us. I'll draw 3 objects on the board. Object A, Object B, Object C. Which of these 3 objects most participates in the concept of squareness? You all agree A? Which one least participates in it? You all agree. Okay, now y'all aren't math majors, but all of you instantly are able to perceive the degree of squareness present in these objects in the world around you, just like all of you were able to perceive harmony and dissonance, even without any musical training. There's something about this that is innate within us. Look around this room. Notice the tabletop in front of you, and the tiles on the board, and the white screen, and the door, and the window in the door. What do they all have in common? They're all rectangles, exactly. How does your mind do that? We have Formica wood, we have glass, we have cork, we have whatever screens are made of. They all have different functions, they're made of different materials. How does your mind go zip, 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 zip? Rectangles. They're all rectangles. Why does your mind do that? My dog doesn't do that. My dog looks at the world as stuff I can chase, stuff I can eat, stuff I can pee on. But we look at the world and we see geometrical concepts embedded in it. Even though they're not really there and they're not perfectly expressed, our mind still somehow, for some reason, apprehends these things. And Plato is the first to explore why that might be the case. His questions are not just those of cosmology. What is the world made of? How do we understand it? Like the nature philosophers had asked, he is the first one to begin to ask a question that falls under the category called epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that explores how we know things. How do we come to have knowledge? What is the nature and organizing principles of what we hold to be our knowledge? So how do we come to know things? How does our mind figure stuff like this out? When I look out at my audience here, I see people with pale skin, dark skin, in-between skin, long hair, short hair, unkempt hair. You all look very different from each other. So why don't I get confused and think I'm looking at a dozen different species of animal sitting in front of me? How do I look through all of your differences and apprehend you all share something called human, even though you look so different? And if a monkey comes in the room, I'm going to realize almost, but not quite. You don't quite fit the category. What's the discerning ability I have that makes these distinctions and organize and classifies these things? How do I organize my knowledge in this way? What am I referring things to? What am I accessing to make sense out of the world?
Similarities and differences.
Part of it, we begin by looking at similarities and differences. But we have a lot of similarities to monkeys, and we have a lot of differences from each other. And somehow we draw these fine distinctions. Plato's answer to all these kinds of questions is that there must be more to the world than just the physical reality we see around us. Like the nature philosophers, he concluded that the evidence of the five senses cannot be the totality of all that is real. There must be more to it. The nature philosophers knew this because they were trying to figure out why the world continued to exist when everything in it was temporary. So they postulated there must be some eternal subsubstance that becomes the conglomerates and the things of temporary sense experience that resolves back into the substance to form into other things. They were the materialist philosophers. They're asking, what is the physical world made of? Plato, following Socrates, is exploring ethical questions and is wondering about the nature of how we have this knowledge itself. And like Pythagoras, who had begun to steer philosophy towards the realm of abstract mathematics and looking at geometrical forms and ratios, Plato is going to carry on with that and begin to see that there must be a whole realm of invisible concepts, things he called forms, that exists behind the physical world. Forms with a capital F. We live down here in this physical realm. And standing down here, we might see a black horse and a white horse and a big horse. Horses with different characteristics to them. Laugh at my horse. But somehow our mind is able to see that despite the differences in size and color, that somehow they all participate in the form of ideal horse. They're all variations on this theme of horse. So our eyes are going and stopping at the differences. But our mind, the rational component within us, whatever that thing is, the mind does something else. And it's going, the mind rises above the different things in the world to perceive the ideal form, the abstract concept that they all partake of, that they're all variations of. And this is his answer to how we make sense out of the world. We are bombarded by millions of physical objects and sense experiences every day. How do we make sense out of this cacophony of the experiences that we have? Plato believed that the rational soul, they didn't know what your brain was for in the ancient world. They just thought our human souls had the spark of rationality in it. And he thought that our rational soul somehow had the ability to perceive the invisible realm of forms that lie behind things. And that these things must be the true reality. Now, that's all well and good for an organizing principle. We group together all the horses under the form of horse, and all the humans under the form of human, and all the rectangular shaped objects under the form of rectangle. But the cosmological question began with, what is real? What is the universe really made of? What is it all about? And what's more real, the idea of square in my head or the physical square I can draw on the board? What has more substance to it? The one on the board, right? Where's that square now? Gone. So I'll ask you again. What has more real substance to it? This crude ink mark that failed every definition of square and lasted for about 10 minutes while I tormented you with this lecture, or the eternal perfect concept of square, which meets every definition, which has existed since before you were born and will be here long after you're gone, the eternal perfect concept or the crude 10-minute ink mark, what is more substantially real? Maybe the concept in the mind is, in a sense, more real than the physical object. I mean, without the idea in my mind, how do I even make a square? How did I even approximate, however crudely, this idea of square if I didn't first have a concept to tap into to guide my hand? The mind taps into the form of square, and then my mind directs my hand to replicate that thing that my mind has first tapped into. What's more real, you or the shadow you cast? You're more real than your shadow, right? Without you, there can be no shadow. You have more substance than your shadow. The idea is reality. That's the shadow that it casts down here in this physical realm. Make sense? Okay. So that's essentially how Plato views the world and how we're able to make sense out of the world and come up to these abstract concepts. Mathematical concepts are the simplest things to comprehend. Geometrical forms we can think of without reference to physical things. I can think about the concept of rectangle without having a physical rectangular shaped table in front of me. And in my mind, this rectangle has perfectly straight sides, perfectly 90-degree angles, the opposite sides are perfectly parallel, and it is a two-dimensional form without any third-dimensional intrusion whatsoever. My mind can hold the concept of rectangle and triangle and circle. But in the physical world, I will never be able to replicate something that meets all those definitions. But I can only make sense of the world by referring things to those concepts that it most closely resembles. And I organize my world and my experiences in that way. So it is the difference between looking at the physical pyramids of Egypt, casting shadows, being beautiful but somewhat imperfect, and then my mind realizing that I am making sense of this because I see how it participates in the form of triangle, in the geometrical concept. What we see being formed here is a hierarchical structure. The broad physical world full of physical things, and then a small number of forms that gives rise to the things. Now, Aristotle, when he was a student of Plato's, once asked him a good question. He said, Master Plato, I understand that there must be more things than forms, because one form can give rise to and explain thousands and thousands of things. And we know that all of the horse-looking things are organized under the form of horse because our mind apprehends this. But how are all the forms related to each other? How do we know that these are all forms? That they're all of the same class of things up on this higher level? Is there some ultimate form at the top of all this? Some super form that gives rise to individual forms, which then give rise to individual things? What's at the apex of this hierarchy of reality that we're constructing? And Plato had an answer. What this is all leading to. In the allegory of the cave, it talks about leaving this world of ignorance and shadows and seeing progressively higher levels of reality until outside the cave you see the actual real things. Now remember, this is symbolism, it's an allegory, so all of this has to be understood as being a dimension higher than what it's saying. That world of shadows is really the physical real world you live in, so-called real world. The world outside the cave are really these abstract concepts. When you get to the very top, what is the last thing that prisoner is able to look at when he's finally an enlightened philosopher? The sun, and the sun is a symbol. What does the sun symbolize? So one of the last things in the allegory, the sun represents, what is the enlightenment? What is that thing? We're looking for, what is the essence of being? What is the nature of the universe? It's a Greek word we've talked about already. Well, you'll have it translated anyway. It says that the sun represents the good. Remember? The good. So the universe ultimately is good. That's good. The problem here, though, is that you're reading an English translation from Plato's Greek original. And in the Greek original, the word that he uses doesn't really have an English translation. Every translation I've ever read always concludes with this being called the good. But that's flawed because it's limited. There was another word he used, a Greek word, that is the real answer to his question. And that word is the logos. Remember that word? Remember what logos means? Mind, thought, reason, structure. Remember, the logos was this almost mystical belief about a rational force that permeates the entire universe. It is the origin of the universe, and it is the nature of the universe itself. It is the organizing principle that makes the world around us not just chaotic, but actually understandable, comprehensible, organized into classes and qualities of things. In our soul, our rational bit within us has a spark of that logos. And that allows us to understand, to comprehend the invisible structure of the physical world around us. It's why we can look at the world and see it in terms of mathematical equations and concepts of physics, things that you don't see directly, but it's how you understand the world. You don't see gravity as a thing, but you know it's real, right? You don't see most of the electromagnetic radiation around you, but you know it's there, right? You don't see atoms and electrons and neutrons, but you know they're real, right? Most of what you know to be real is stuff that your senses cannot access directly. After 24 centuries since the time of Plato, we're a lot more comfortable. We're raised with the idea that a lot of what's real in the world is not directly accessible by the senses. Plato is writing in a world in which this is a very, very new idea, and trying to convince people that the physical world around them is really just a dim shadow of a higher realm that you can't really see. You might say that perhaps they'd be skeptical. So this translation of the word logos, you need all these words together to really come close to capturing what the Greek philosophers meant by logos. You understand it, of course, also as the suffix on the sciences, biology, zoology, paleontology, anthropology, that logi on the end, which means the study of whatever the prefix is. Meaning you're not just collecting anecdotal information about this or that subject, you're understanding the universal principles that lie behind the subject. That's what it means to study the science of something. So here is Plato's view of the world. It all emerges from this rational ordering logos, which is a good thing. It becomes the variety of forms, and the forms are what our mind is able to access to make sense of the multiplicity of things around us, to make sense of it all, to organize them into groups, into categories. This is also Plato's answer to why it is that human knowledge grows, why we improve upon the past, why we learn more. Plato's philosophy has been the most optimistic intellectual jolt in the arm of Western civilization. the belief that the objects that we think about, the ideas that we hold to, are a truer reality. And since they are the true reality, we ought to spend our time down here trying to make this world more in accordance with it. It's what would, for Plato, explain progress. Right? Look at the chairs you're sitting in. They fairly comfortable? Right? Got a little flexing on the back stuff. How did the chair get invented, do you think? What's the first evidence that the human species has invented the chair? Because we know they didn't have it back in the Paleolithic, right? They were nomads, they lived on the move. Why would you build a chair? You can't carry it around with you everywhere. So we know that there was a time in which the human race did not have chairs, but now we do. How did we come up with this idea? What's the first chair? You saw the evidence in this class. Remember the...
One of the idols.
Yeah. Very good. The Lady of the Beasts of Çatalhöyük. Exactly. So we have this 8,000, 9,000-year-old little stone carving, terracotta image of this fertility goddess, queen, whatever she is, sitting on a throne, which means in Çatalhöyük they have invented chairs. Now, how did they come up with that? We can speculate how they perhaps came up with this. They've just moved down from their hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They're doing the farming, they're building more permanent structures, and they're thinking to themselves, you know what, I'm tired of sitting on the ground. I need something to sit on. Now, I don't think that the first chair was made by some craftsman with a bunch of sticks, just randomly throwing them together until, holy moly, I bet I could sit on that thing. I don't think that's how that happened. I think he must have been thinking about the idea of something I can sit on. And he noodled around with it until he found something to approximate it. And so maybe he invented the first three-legged stool. It was fairly comfortable, better than sitting on the floor. And then he remembered, you know what, back before we left our hunter-gatherer days, there was that flat piece of rock outside the cave. I used to be able to lean back on the cave wall behind it. Man, that was comfortable. I wonder if maybe I could in some way, and then maybe he invents a little back to his chair. And with a bit of experience, he starts making four-legged chairs. And Our Lady of the Beast gets her throne that she sits on. And a taller back, be a better head support. And on it goes. When your grandparents went to college, they sat in wooden chairs with four legs and backs on them. But you're not sitting in one of those, are you? Look what you're sitting on. Look at that tubular steel construction and ergonomically formed plastic to hug up under your hindquarters so that you can sit comfortably during this lecture. Why didn't we content ourselves with this? This was a perfectly functional chair for your grandparents. But we didn't do that, did we? We continued thinking, how can I make a better chair? How can I improve upon the concept of chair to make it more ideal, more comfortable? And then we start making them with a little more ergonomic design to them. And then we start figuring out ways to simplify the manufacturing process, right? At some point, we began attaching a little desk tablet to the chair. And how many of y'all are left-handed? Okay, remember going into the classroom and trying to look for the one or two left-handed desks somewhere? And so a lot of the classrooms you're in today, instead, they have simply a central tablet here that you can then access from either side. Ambidextrous desk, and you can come in either way and fit in there. So we don't have to specialize anymore. Or now we can have something that's even more ergonomically formed, comfortable for you. We keep improving and improving upon the chair. And if you grow up and become the professor, look at this bad boy you get to sit in. Look at this amazing product of ergonomic engineering. 5 legs on wheels, upholstered, cushioned. It can go up and down. I can move back and forth. I can zip over and chat with this guy and come over here, talk to Reggie. I can spin around in it. It's awesome. Is this the final chair? We're going to continue improving on the chair, aren't we? Maybe one day we'll have little levitating pads. And as soon as we go to sit down, the holographic machines will solidify some matter around us to perfectly catch us and respond to every little movement and motion that we make. for the ideal of comfort and sitting down. What drives that? Why do we keep improving and improving? How do we know what direction to improve in? Now, the modern world, you probably have a little more sophisticated understandings of this. We identify shortcomings in what we have. We find ways to improve it. We make incremental advances. But Plato's answer would have been more along the lines of, we're getting closer and closer to the ideal form of chair. And there's something that draws us onwards. Because the real part of us is not this meat sack we live in. This will come to an end after enough decades go by. But the rational soul part of us, the real thing, the part of us that understands the world, that is the part that taps into these forms and is able to keep pursuing it and getting closer. With more practice and experience, we make things a little better and a little better and a little better. And this process will continue, well, till we're all spiritual forms of some sort. All right. Now, so far I've been talking about simple things. Horses and chairs and square-shaped things and so forth. This isn't really the kind of thing that's on Plato's mind. These are simple examples to make the idea clear and to make it convincing. But far more important are other kinds of forms, like justice, truth, beauty, fairness, courage. Concepts and qualities that we know we want human beings to embrace and to participate in, but how we become that way is what he really is after here. And remember, Plato was at the trial of Socrates. And Socrates was not lynched by an angry mob. It wasn't a bunch of pissed off parents who were tired of their kids sassing back in the style of Socrates that dragged him out and hung him. He had a trial. He went to court. He had a legal trial. They followed all the legal proceedings of Athens. He was legally sentenced and legally put to death. So the sentence of Socrates was legal. But do any of you think that Socrates received justice at his trial? No? How is it possible that the world's first democracy, in the home of philosophical and rational speculation, could send their wisest, albeit somewhat cranky and strange little dude? How could they have sent this guy to his death? I mean, I could see some tyrannical king doing this. They don't like people that are smarting off and asking questions, but this is a democracy. How can we have the letter of the law followed and yet the spirit of law so grossly violated? That's what's really on Plato's mind. Ever since the trial of Socrates, he was absolutely vexed with this problem of what is wrong with people? Why can't they see how to behave in a way that is truly just and fair and courageous? Why do they fall into so many errors in their actions? And how do we get people to stop doing that? If you've ever gotten a speeding ticket that you felt you didn't deserve, it was a speed trap, or ever found yourself losing some argument, some case, where you felt like the principle had been violated, even though legally you lost, then you understand Plato's position. The difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The whole purpose of having law is to enforce justice. We make laws to keep just sentences occurring in society. And yet here it went horribly awry. So this philosophy was largely triggered by that. His presence at the trial of Socrates, the memory of that never left Plato. And he maintains the memory and the tradition of his master Socrates in all of the dialogues that he wrote. And that is one reason why Plato wrote dialogues. For Plato, philosophy wasn't just for a bunch of beady-eyed scholars in libraries. Philosophy was for everybody, every citizen who votes and therefore plays a role in deciding the actions of their country. Every one of them must be a philosopher. You must think rationally and carefully about why you hold the opinions you do and whether or not these opinions are just. And if you have not subjected yourself to careful, honest questioning and found that you have a rational defense for all of your positions, that you can support with clear evidence and proper moral principles those things that you hold to be your opinion, then you've not really thought them through at all in the first place. And unfortunately, it seemed like most people really hadn't thought through their opinions. Most people just kind of go along with the crowd. Most people just sort of do what seems to be popular or what feels good at the time. Remember, Socrates was just barely found guilty on the charges by a very thin little margin. And then more people voted to put him to death than had voted him guilty in the first place. How can you vote that this guy is innocent and then 15 minutes later vote to put him to death? What happened in that interim? Socrates made him mad with his cavalier response, what do I deserve for what I've done? How about a life pension for all the work I've done on your behalf, Athens? They were pissed off. And they responded with their anger, their emotions. Rationally, we can look back at a safe distance of history and realize that Socrates, simply got rooked at his trial because we don't have our emotions invested in it. This is the hard thing. Have you ever been in a position where emotionally you felt one way, but rationally you felt differently? And have you ever decided to just go with your gut feeling and your emotions? And did it maybe turn out not so good? Yep. It's hard to put your rational mind in control. Right? We have debates periodically in this country about whether or not it should be legal to burn the American flag. When I see people burning an American flag on television, it angers me. I love this country. This country is awesome. Think I could live the life I live anywhere else in the world? Western civilization, America, best place to be. So it irritates me, makes me angry. But if we made it illegal to burn the American flag, what rational principle would that violate? Freedom of speech and freedom of expression. What I value about this country, partly, is that we have freedom of speech and expression. So you've got to give yourself a hard example like this. Obviously, we're all going to agree it should be illegal to, torture a puppy or something like that. Okay, morally, rationally, emotionally, no part of us wants to do that. But when you have a case where you feel one way in your gut, but your mind is telling you something else, that's when courage is required to go with your rational mind instead of your gut feeling. This country we live in is in many ways a product of Platonic optimism, of the belief that the objects of thought are the true reality. Our founding fathers lived in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment. They were philosophical. Most of them read Latin. Many of them read Greek. They were thoroughly versed in Roman history, Greek philosophy. They studied the classics. 18th century was a popular time for studying the classics. And think about it. When they went to design this country, what made them think that they could do something that would be better than what they had before? I mean, if you have a rebellion and overthrow your king, how do you know you're not going to just get another worse king afterwards? Look what's happened in the Middle East after the Arab Spring. They overthrew all their tyrant dictators. Now they got worse dictators. That's usually what happens. So what gave our founding fathers the confidence that they could rebel against the King of England and then just invent a form of government that would be better than what they'd had before? What made them believe they could do it? I would say that a lot of this has to do with the optimism that Platonic idealism gives you, that the objects of thought are the true reality. Because they weren't going to form a country based on divine right monarchs. They didn't form a country based on the Bible or religion. They formed a country based on ideas. And you can see those ideas right there in the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. Now, back in my day, nobody left junior high school without being able to recite the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. How about you kids today? Can you do it? I'll start you off. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, pause, in order to form a more perfect union. Let that line sink in for a minute. Did they think they were going to make a utopian paradise? No. They were more pragmatic than that. They were more realistic than that. They were simply trying to make a country that would be a little better than what we'd had before, a more perfect union. And they designed a flexible document that we'd be able to continue to revise and work on and improve upon as we march forward in the process of civilization. And this was going to be a country that was based on philosophical concepts. Let's go through the whole thing and listen for the forms. Okay? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So what were the forms you just heard? What concepts? Justice, tranquility, domestic tranquility. Okay, you need common defense. Okay, these are the ideas that our country was based on. And what made our founding fathers believe that they could overthrow a divine right monarchy, rebel, and create a country based on ideas? These things in their head? Because they were idealists, in the best sense of the word. They believed that the objects of thought are the true reality. And these objects of thought, things like justice and fairness and the pursuit of happiness, these things are what are real. And it is our duty down here as thinking, intelligent beings to work to make our life here more in accordance with that higher world that only the mind can tap into. What the objects of thought tell us, that's what we need to be pursuing. So you live in the product of Platonic idealism, whether you knew it or not. All right, a few more details on Plato. First of all, a very difficult question. All of this is very uplifting philosophy. The world is just and true. We just have to focus our minds and achieve it. But you know what? The reality we live in down here is full of really crappy people, isn't it? People that do bad things. If I see a Boy Scout push a little old lady out of the way of a car coming at her, I'm going to say, wow, that was courageous. Or I can see a soldier throw himself on a grenade and save his comrades. I'm going to say, that was courageous. I'm going to look at two totally different things and recognize the form of courage that was participating in their actions. Their actions have taken this form of courage. But what about people that do things that are cowardly and cruel and unjust and ugly? How do we explain that? Are there like negative forms pulling on us from the other direction? Like for all these high and noble things, there's also negative ones and they pull on us in either way? How many of y'all think that? That evil is a substantial force that tugs on you with the same strength as goodness, and you're caught in the middle? Nobody. That's because you're not a dualist. That idea that there's negative powers and positive powers pulling in either direction is called dualism. And there were some early Christians who were dualists, but it was eventually declared heretical and they went away into history. But no, Christianity is actually going to borrow a whole lot of this. And what they're going to borrow is something else that they liked about it, the explanation for evil. If people's bad actions are not explained by bad forms pulling on them, what's the only other way to explain it? Plato's way. How would Plato explain this in simple language? that participates in the form of triangle, right? To some degree. What's that called? A bad triangle. A form that very weakly participates in triangle. It's an untriangle. It lacks triangulariness within the thing. So you're either going to push that little old lady out of the way of that Mack truck about to mow her down and participate in courage, or if you don't do it and you run away scared, you're not participating in cowardice. How would Plato put it? Louder?
You just don't engage with the courage.
You simply were not engaged with courage. There's courage and then there's lack of courage. And we can call lack of courage cowardice, but cowardice isn't a real thing. Courage is a real thing. And the lack of it makes the bad results. Plato's argument to this question about evil, which every philosophy and every religion has to grapple with at some point. If there is a good God up there, why does the devil exist? You got to come up with some kind of explanation for this. And Plato's answer is that evil is not a substantial thing. It's not anything that's real. Evil, what we call evil, is simply a lack of the good. You either participate in the higher forms or you're ignorant of the higher forms. So for Plato, there's not really good and evil in the world. There's good and ignorance of the good. And people who act in ignorance of the good are the ones who cause the problems and do the things that we call evil. For example, think about all those Wall Street executives and their wild speculations that crashed the economy several years ago. People lost their life savings. Your grandparents who were just about to retire comfortably suddenly had to keep working and live in much, humbler ways than they had planned on. You got grandparents eating cat food because the economy crashed. Do you think those Wall Street executives were consumed with demons? Greed motivated them, right? The desire for money. So here they were down here manipulating things in this world to make more money happen for them. Now, if they'd been a little more philosophical, they might realize that domestic tranquility and fairness and opportunity mean you have to deal above board, not lie about the value of some stocks, not let other people get rooked on it while you sell all your shares because you know things they don't know. You know that that's not fair, or you should know. But they were driven by an ideology that says the more money I can make for myself, the better. They were pursuing the things of this world rather than pursuing higher truths. And so it wasn't that they were possessed by evil forces. They were simply ignorant of the good that would have somewhat tempered their desire for wealth in light of your enlightened self-interest of the good of the society you live in. And so it causes the problems. Ignorance of the good, not just being driven by evil. This was what Christianity liked about Platonism. Early Christianity absorbs a huge amount of Platonic thinking. They needed like a philosophical backbone for the religion based on the moral teachings of Jesus, and this is where they found it, because this works perfectly. You still have this in your pop culture today. Can the devil just grab you by the throat and drag you into hell? No. How's the devil get you in his clutches?
You have to sell your soul. You have to give
And how does he get you to do that? That seems like a foolish thing to do. How does he get you to do it?
pay off something in return.
He offers you, say it again? Temptations. And what does the devil tempt you with? The things of this world. The things that in your short-sightedness you desire, right? When the devil went down to Georgia and he's looking for a soul to steal, he's in a bind, he's way behind, he's willing to make a deal, what does he offer Johnny?
Fiddle made of gold.
A fiddle made of gold, right? What does he offer the aspiring rock star when they meet at the crossroads? I'll make you famous. In that Keanu Reeves movie, The Devil's Advocate, what does he offer the lawyer? Success. Juries will bend to your will. You'll never lose a case. The devil offers you power and wealth and fame. He offers you the things that are of this world to get you to choose to turn away from these high things and towards this stuff here in the world. That also means that Judgment Day is fair. Because if the devil really was equally powerful as the good angels and stuff, then it's really not your fault when you do bad. The little angel and demon on your shoulders whispering in either ear and stuff, right? If you get tugged one way or the other, hapless mortal in the middle. But this the church liked because it means that you really are responsible for your actions. You either know the good and pursue it, or you act in ignorance of it. You turn away from it towards lower things. St. Augustine, an early church father, said that, I realize that evil is not a substance. Evil is the perversion of will, away from the supreme substance and towards lower things. That was very Platonic speaking that he was doing. And you'll find that early Christianity is saturated with it. Some of you might know some famous lines in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh. Okay. The Gospel of John is very different than the other three. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all historical memories, but John is a very theological, interpretive description of the meaning of the life of Jesus. So Jesus says things in there that he doesn't say in the other Gospels. It's a whole different species of writing. And it also absorbs this idea. Anybody want to guess what language the Gospels are written in originally? Greek. It's written in Greek. Greek was the international language of the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus, so if you want a lot of people to read your stuff, you write it in Greek. And in the Greek original, you want to guess what that line actually reads as? In the beginning was the Logos. The Logos was with God. The Logos was God, and the Logos was made flesh. The Gospel of John uses the same Platonic philosophical term because he's trying to communicate this message to Greeks and Romans who've grown up studying Greek philosophy. This is their cultural touchstones. These are the framework they understand things from. And so it's explained in those terms. They're basically saying that the mind and reason and thought of God was made flesh, and that was Jesus. So it's language they could comprehend. So this is one of the reasons that Platonic thought has so permeated Western culture. It keeps getting revived over and over again. The early Christians absorb it as Christian Platonism. The Italian Renaissance revives the study of it as Neoplatonism. Our founding fathers in the Enlightenment were just imbued with the study of the classical world. Plato, all through Western civilization, has given us the optimistic belief that those things that we think about aren't just irrelevant fantasies. Those concepts which we get through by rational philosophical speculation, they are real things, and they are the ultimate reality, the true reality. This world is just passing your time away unless you're focused on pursuing that. A meaningful life is the life of the philosopher that is thinking about what is true and what is valuable and shapes their life in accordance with it. Not just filling it with, cheese pizza and television. Nothing against cheese pizza, by the way. Can a vampire just fly into your bedroom and suck your blood? How do they get in your room? You have to invite them in. Exactly. Your post-Christian pop culture references to the forces of good and evil, just like that Charlie Daniels song, are saturated with Platonic thinking. All of this has largely made sense to you. This whole lecture is rung true because you've grown up thinking Platonic thoughts without realizing that you were doing so. This is so basic to the whole Western approach to reality that all of this made sense along the way, and this is basically just the origins where it came from.